My father's last words were simple: never sell the red tractors. But when 4,000 acres faced total bankruptcy, I had to choose between keeping a dead man's pride or saving my family's land. I broke his final wish and risked everything on a brand new green fleet. The entire town called me a traitor. The bank gave me 90 days. This is the story of how I lost my family to save the farm. The auction was scheduled for March 14th. It was a cold morning, with heavy mud clinging to everything. The kind of day where your boots stick to the earth with every step, and the raw wind cuts straight through 3 layers of denim, like they aren't even there. The estate sale company had set up along the gravel drive leading into the Hollenbeck farm, just outside Manning, Iowa. Folding tables, a registration booth, hot coffee, and paper cups that nobody was drinking, and lined up in perfect formation across the east pasture, like soldiers waiting to be deployed one last time, sat 14 Massey Ferguson tractors. Every single one of them red, every one of them maintained like museum pieces. The oldest was a classic 1135 from 1976. The newest was a pair of massive 8S series tractors purchased just 18 months before Thomas Hollenbeck died. Thomas had built the operation from 900 acres to just over 4,000 in 4 decades. He had done it with Massey Ferguson iron and nothing else. He believed in the red paint the way some men believe in Holy Scripture. When cancer took him fast, in 11 short weeks, he left behind a will that was only 2 pages long. Most of it dealt with land distribution and water rights. But there was one single paragraph typed in bold that his son would never forget. It stated that under no circumstances should the Massey Ferguson equipment ever leave the family. The machines were not just tools, they were the foundation. Selling them, Thomas wrote, would be a betrayal of everything he had bled for. 6 months later, his son stood in the auction crowd and watched those red machines sell off one by one. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the pasture. Sold, sold, sold. The entire fleet went in 90 minutes, raising $3.1 million. Standing in the mud with his arms crossed was David Hollenbeck, 34 years old, a 4th-generation farmer, and the man who had just violated his father's final wish in front of 200 neighbors. His mother hadn't shown up. His uncle had called him a disgrace the night before. His younger brother had driven right past the farm that morning without stopping. Only David's wife stood by him, looking as uncertain as the rest of the county. David had just set family tradition on fire, and every eye in Iowa was on him. The silence that followed the auction was heavier than the March mud. Within 48 hours, the full reality of David Hollenbeck's exile settled over the farm. In a rural community where family names are tied to the soil for generations, breaking a patriarch's final wish isn't seen as a business decision. It is treated as a moral failing. His mother, Martha, moved her belongings to a small house in town 3 miles away. When David drove over to check on her, she didn't answer the door. She stood behind the sheer curtains of the front window, looking at him for a long moment before turning off the porch light. She had spent 40 years riding shotgun in those red cabs alongside Thomas, building a life out of long days and shared sacrifices. To her, seeing those Massey Fergusons loaded onto flatbed trailers wasn't modernizing the operation, it was scrubbing her late husband's memory from the land. The rest of the family closed ranks just as fast. His uncle Harlan, who farmed 1,100 acres on the eastern border of the township, stopped by the co-op while David was loading seed. In front of 3 counterhands and 2 local board members, Harlan didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned over the truck bed and told David that as far as the Hollenbeck legacy was concerned, Thomas had died twice, once in the hospital and once in the east pasture. His younger brother Mark, who had taken an off-farm job with a seed company in Des Moines, blocked David's number by the end of the week. The only person left sitting across from David at the kitchen table was his wife, Emily. She didn't scold him, nor did she join the chorus of outrage, but the tension was carved deep into her face. Every time she went to the grocery store in town or picked the kids up from school, she felt the cold shifts in the room, the sudden pauses in conversation, the averted glances in the aisle. She trusted David's mind for numbers, but even she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice when she looked at the empty machine shed. David knew what the county thought of him. He was the ungrateful son who traded his father's lifetime of work for a fresh start. But sitting in the quiet kitchen, Staring at financial spreadsheets that no one else in his family had cared to read, David knew the truth. He hadn't made this choice out of spite. He had made it because the farm was dying from the inside out, and standing still meant losing everything. The numbers on David's desk didn't care about tradition, memory, or brand loyalty. They were written in black ink, and they told a story of financial bleeding that his family had spent years ignoring. For all the pride Thomas Hollenbeck took in his red fleet, the operational reality of those machines was quietly pushing the 4,000-acre operation toward a cliff. David pulled up the ledger from the previous 2 seasons. Under full load during spring tillage, his father's Massey Ferguson tractors were burning an average of 23 gallons of diesel per hour. Across a 6-week working window, that extra fuel burn wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a $60,000 tax on the farm's operating margin. Worse still were the constant emissions system regeneration cycles, which forced engines to idle or run at reduced power every 4 to 6 hours, burning daylight during the narrow planting windows that dictated their annual yields. Then came the maintenance logs. Across the 14-unit fleet, repairs and routine service had topped $47,000 over the last 12 months alone. Hydraulic pumps failing under pressure, transmission sensors throwing constant error codes, and electrical gremlins that required field technicians to travel 2 hours from the dealership just to plug in a diagnostic laptop. And that dealership relationship had drifted into a quiet trap. The local Massey Ferguson dealer in Carroll knew Thomas would never buy anywhere else. Because of that unconditional loyalty, pricing on replacement parts had crept up year after year, while turnaround times on critical components stretched from hours into days. During the previous fall harvest, a single failed bearing on the combine had stalled harvesting for 4 days during a rain threat because the dealer didn't keep the assembly in local stock. When David had gently brought up fuel economy and parts availability to the sales manager, the response had been polite but dismissive. They assumed a Hollenbeck would always sign on the line for red paint, no matter the cost. Sitting alone in the farm office, looking at spreadsheets that stretched back a decade, David saw what his family refused to acknowledge. His father hadn't been running a more profitable farm by sticking with tradition. He had been writing massive checks to cover up operational waste, masking inefficiency as loyalty. Thomas had been willing to bleed money to keep a color on his tractors. David wasn't. The secret meeting took place on a damp Tuesday afternoon in late February, 3 weeks before the auction was ever announced. David had driven 15 miles south to an unworked 40-acre parcel south of Templeton, far enough off the main highway to keep local eyes from prying. Waiting for him at the edge of the turn row was a John Deere sales representative named Mark Miller, standing beside a brand-new John Deere 8R310. The green paint and bright yellow rims looked almost shocking against the backdrop of gray Iowa sky and dark mud. There were no long sales pitches or corporate speeches. Mark simply handed David the keys, pointed toward the cab, and told him to put the machine through its paces. David climbed the cab steps, settled into the air ride seat, and pulled the door shut. The immediate silence inside the cab was striking, sealing out the harsh wind and diesel rumble down to a low, quiet hum. For 3 hours, David ran the 8R through heavy ground, switching between simulated tillage loads, high-speed transport passes, and PTO operations. He monitored the live telemetry screen on the armrest display with hawk-like focus. The numbers didn't lie. The John Deere's engine managed the load without struggling, and its e-auto power transmission shifted between power bands seamlessly. When David calculated the live fuel rate consumption, the monitor showed a 17% reduction in fuel burn compared to his father's red tractors under the exact same working conditions. It wasn't just about fuel economy. The price per horsepower worked out to $41,000 less than an equivalent replacement package from his old dealer, backed by a local John Deere dealership network that had 3 fully stocked service centers within 25 miles of his property. Down here in the field, away from the emotional noise of family tradition and township gossip, the choice became crystal clear. This wasn't a rebellion against his father, nor was it an impulsive reaction. It was a cold, calculated move for survival. When David stepped down from the cab, he looked Mark Miller straight in the eye and shook his hand. Before the sun dipped below the horizon, David signed the preliminary paperwork for a total fleet replacement package: 4 8R series tractors, 2 high-horsepower 9R units, and a flagship John Deere S790 combine. The total order came to $2.3 million. David was putting everything on the line, betting the entire future of the Hollenbeck farm on green paint. On March 22nd, the first transport trailer backed down the long gravel driveway of the Hollenbeck farm. The lowboy trailer carried a John Deere 8R280, its signature green hood and bright yellow wheel hubs gleaming under the pale early spring sun. The driver unchained the tie-downs and backed the machine off the ramps. The quiet diesel engine idle echoed against the steel side paneling of the main machine shed, a building that had housed nothing but red paint for over 40 years. David stood near the corner of the shop, watching the tractor roll through the high bay doors. Seeing green iron parked on the concrete where his father's Massey Fergusons had sat for decades felt surreal. It looked foreign. It looked like an intrusion. But when the delivery driver climbed down and handed over the inspection checklist, David stepped up into the cab, turned the key, and listened to the engine settle into a steady, clean hum. There were no warning lights flickering on the console, no smell of unburnt fuel, and no lingering mechanical issues to worry about. By the 1st of April, the complete delivery was finished. Lined up side by side inside the clean machine shed sat 4 John Deere 8R series tractors, 2 high-horsepower 9R units built for heavy tillage, and a giant S790 combine resting in the back bay like a statement piece. The financing was locked at 4.7% over 7 years through John Deere Financial, creating a payment schedule that was tight but manageable if the farm hit its projected corn and soybean yields. For the first time since his father had fallen ill, the weight on David's chest began to lift. He walked down the center aisle of the shop between 2 rows of green equipment, running his hand along the smooth composite hoods. Outside the shed doors, the county was still talking, his family was still silent, and the local rumors were still circulating at the co-op. But inside the shop, surrounded by efficient, modern equipment that was ready to work 4,000 acres without breaking down, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt genuine, grounded optimism for the future. The talk reached every corner of the county within a week. At the Manning Diner, over morning coffee and greasy breakfast plates, the consensus was unanimous. David Hollenbeck had completely lost his mind. Over at the local grain co-op, farmers leaning against the counter traded rumors while waiting for chemical orders. The story was always the same. David was an arrogant, ungrateful heir, throwing away 40 years of red Massey Ferguson heritage just to prove a point. They predicted that the moment those green John Deere tractors hit heavy Iowa clay, the electronic controls would glitch, the dealer support would fail, and David would be on his knees begging for forgiveness. David heard the whispers, but he didn't waste a single second offering explanations. Instead, he put his head down and focused entirely on the ground in front of him. Mid-April brought dry weather, and the new green fleet rolled out into the fields to begin spring tillage. The performance spoke for itself almost immediately. The John Deere 9R units pulled 16-shank deep rippers through wet, heavy gumbo without a trace of engine hesitation. The power delivery was smooth, and the GPS guidance system locked onto straight guidance tracks with pinpoint accuracy. David's 2 seasonal field hands, older guys who had worked for his father for over a decade and were openly skeptical of the brand switch, changed their minds by the end of the 3rd afternoon. The quiet cab environment, air ride comfort, and effortless control setups meant they climbed out of the operator seats after 14-hour shifts, feeling fresh instead of exhausted. David took his management a step further, establishing a rigorous record-keeping routine. He created a detailed digital tracking log to record every gallon of diesel pumped, every engine hour logged, every service interval completed, and every acre worked per hour. He wasn't tracking the data to boast to his neighbors or win an argument at the diner. He was doing it because he knew he was walking a razor-thin financial wire. If this green equipment gamble succeeded, he wanted hard, undeniable numbers that proved his operational decision was right. And if it failed, he wanted to know exactly why before the farm went under. By mid-May, the high-stakes risk of the spring planting season was turning into hard operational success. Weather windows across Carroll County were brief and unforgiving, but the green fleet moved through the field acreage with remarkable efficiency. The John Deere 8R tractors ran 14-hour days without a single hitch, planting seed at precise depths across 3,000 acres of corn ground and another 1,000 acres of soybeans. For the first time in nearly a decade, the Hollenbeck farm wrapped up planting 5 days ahead of the regional average. When David pulled up his tracking spreadsheets at the end of the 6th week, the operational data confirmed what he had felt out in the field. The numbers were undeniable. Overall fuel consumption across the entire fleet had dropped by 11% compared to the previous year's red Massey Ferguson usage over the exact same acreage. That single efficiency gain translated to $18,000 in direct fuel savings in less than 2 months. The e-auto power transmissions handled constant load shifts seamlessly, allowing the engines to pull heavy implements at lower RPMs without sacrificing speed or torque. Field coverage was up, idle time was down, and 0 hours were lost to mechanical repairs or emissions regeneration delays. His seasonal drivers were no longer just comfortable. They were operating with a speed and precision that kept input costs lean and output metrics high. Late one evening, David walked out to the edge of his northern quarter section. The early corn shoots were emerging from the dark Iowa soil in razor-straight green rows that stretched to the horizon. Standing in the cool evening breeze with his tablet in hand, looking at a paper trail of proven efficiency, David felt a quiet sense of validation wash over him. The bank payments were still massive, and his family was still distant, but the raw data proved his thesis was correct. The decision to switch to John Deere wasn't an emotional gamble. It was a sound, profitable strategy that was keeping the farm alive. The call didn't come from David's regular loan officer at First Central Bank. It came directly from the regional credit director, a man named Marcus Vance, whose office sat on the top floor of the branch in Des Moines. The tone of his voice was courteous, but cold and sharp as a winter razor. Vance asked David if he had 20 minutes to discuss the long-term risk profile of his current operating line. The bank had received unexpected inquiries from several influential figures in the county, including 2 local board members who farmed thousands of acres with red iron and held significant equity in the regional agricultural cooperative. They had raised concerns about David's sudden $2.3 million equipment shift, questioning the projected resale value and trade-in liquidity of a massive John Deere fleet in a territory long dominated by Massey Ferguson dealerships. In an agricultural market driven by local buyer demand, the board members argued, a giant green fleet might prove far harder to liquidate if the Hollenbeck operation faced financial distress. Vance was direct with the reality of the situation. While the bank wasn't revoking David's credit line, the institution was adjusting its oversight parameters immediately. Because David had broken away from established regional equipment patterns and taken on massive new debt in the wake of his father's passing, his financial flexibility was gone. The bank was imposing stricter reporting requirements, demanding monthly balance sheet updates and field performance reports. Vance made it clear that if crop yields dropped below historical averages, or if cash flow tightened during the upcoming harvest, the bank's credit committee would not hesitate to step in, freeze operating capital, or force asset sales to protect their exposure. David hung up the phone and sat in his pickup cab at the end of a field road, staring out at the green canopy of growing corn. The breath left his chest slowly. It was no longer just his family holding a grudge, or his neighbors whispering at the co-op. The institutional power of the county's agricultural network was aligning against him. By choosing green paint, he had stripped away the unwritten safety net that traditional brand loyalty had provided his father for decades. The financial math was sound, but the margin for error had been compressed to absolute zero. One bad week, one unexpected downturn, and the bank would pull the floor out from under him. The mechanical failure struck on the 3rd Friday of June at 4 in the afternoon. David was running one of his new John Deere 8R tractors through a 400-acre parcel near the southern county line, executing a critical post-emergent spraying pass to protect the young crop from fast-growing weeds. Without warning, a high-pressure hydraulic line rubbed against a frame bracket, split wide open under pressure, and sprayed fluid across the side panel before killing hydraulic power to the spray boom. It was a minor wear issue, a simple $50 hose, but the timing could not have been worse. When David called the local John Deere dealership, the parts manager dropped an anchor on his evening. The specific hydraulic hose fitting was out of stock locally and on backorder at the central distribution hub. Delivery would take 5 full days. 5 days sitting idle during the tightest post-emergent application window of the entire summer. By Saturday morning, Word had reached every coffee shop and feed store in Carroll County. The local gossip engine went into overdrive. The narrative was simple and merciless. The fancy green iron had broken down, the dealership had failed, and David's reckless gamble was falling apart at the seams. Sitting at his desk on Sunday afternoon, David's phone vibrated with a single text message from his uncle Harlan. "Told you so." David didn't reply, nor did he indulge in self-pity. He locked his phone in the truck, walked back to the machine shed, and dragged a 20-year-old utility tractor out of semi-retirement. It was slow, lacked modern guidance systems, and required him to work 18-hour days in an uninsulated cab to stay on schedule. But he kept the spray booms moving across every single acre. He didn't make a scene at the dealership, and he didn't give the counter hands at the co-op the satisfaction of seeing him sweat when he picked up extra chemical supplies. He simply kept his head down, pushed through the exhaustion, and completed the field application before the weeds could choke out the crop. The minor breakdown proved that no brand was immune to mechanical bad luck. But David demonstrated something far more important. He was never going to let 5 days of idle green machinery break his resolve. July brought relentless, scorching heat that turned the fertile soil of Carroll County into dusty brick. Day after day, a cloudless, brassy sky baked the Midwest, pushing temperatures past 95 degrees, while a drying wind pulled the last drops of moisture from the earth. By early August, the vibrant green corn leaves were curling tightly into gray spikes, and the soybean pods were halting their development. A severe, regional drought had settled over the heartland. David's projected corn yields plummeted from an optimistic 210 bushels per acre down to a grim 175. Across 4,000 acres, that single environmental hit wiped over $320,000 in top-line revenue off his balance sheet. Out in the blistering fields, the new John Deere tractors operated flawlessly. Their cooling systems managed the extreme ambient temperatures without a single engine warning light. The cabs remained cool and dust-free, and fuel consumption stayed predictably low. But as David drove the turn rows each afternoon, watching the ground crack beneath the heavy tires, the cold reality hit him. The most efficient machinery in the world couldn't make it rain. The mounting financial strain seeped into every corner of his home. David slept in fitful 2-hour stretches, spending his nights staring at cash flow projections and crop insurance indemnity tables that simply refused to balance. He had stopped returning calls from extended family, drained of the energy required to defend his choices against their unspoken judgment. Late one night in mid-August, sitting in the quiet dark of the kitchen with only the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his exhausted face, Emily walked in and placed a mug of warm coffee beside him. She stood there for a long moment, watching the red line items on his spreadsheet, before asking the question that had been hanging over their home for months. "David, do you regret it? Switching to the green iron?" David paused, staring at the screen. He thought about his father's legacy, the harsh whispers at the co-op, and the looming bank payments. Then he looked up at his wife and shook his head with absolute calm. "No, Emily. I don't regret the green machinery for a second. The tractors did everything they were supposed to do. I only regret that I didn't have one more year of financial cushion to weather a summer like this." September brought the autumn harvest, but there was no joy in the fields. The new green John Deere S790 combine performed magnificently. Its advanced rotor technology threshed the crop cleanly. Its cab technology made long night runs effortless, and its fuel efficiency saved thousands compared to his father's old red equipment. But no amount of modern engineering could harvest corn that hadn't grown. The drought had done its damage. When the final bushels were weighed at the grain elevator, the numbers were devastating. Corn averaged a paltry 178 bushels per acre, and soybeans limped in at 48. When David finalized the farm's year-end balance sheet, the operation had posted a net loss of $290,000. Even after factoring in crop insurance payouts, the cash flow deficit was critical. When the annual $2.3 million equipment debt payment came due, David was left sitting with a glaring, terrifying gap. He was short by exactly $73,000. David called Marcus Vance at First Central Bank, explained the situation without making excuses, and asked for a payment deferral until the following spring. The regional credit director's response was measured, polite, and unyielding. The bank's credit committee had reviewed the Hollenbeck file. They would grant a strict 90-day extension on the $73,000 deficit, extending the deadline to late February. But Vance made the conditions crystal clear. If the balance was not paid in full by the end of that window, the bank would begin formal default proceedings, freeze the farm's remaining operating lines, and initiate asset repossession on the John Deere fleet. That evening, David walked out to the darkened machine shed. The grand green tractors and the giant combine sat quiet, their paint still flawless, their screens displaying low engine hours. They had done every single thing David had bought them to do. They had saved fuel, eliminated downtime, and worked efficiently through punishing heat. Yet, because the skies had refused to open, these very machines were now 90 days away from being towed back to the dealership lot under a bank repossession order. David stood alone in the dark, feeling the cold weight of the agricultural world closing in on him from every side. The machine shed was pitch black, except for the sharp amber glow of a single LED charging dock mounted near the workbench. Cold December air seeped beneath the bay doors, bringing with it the quiet, heavy stillness of an Iowa winter night. David sat on an overturned wooden crate beside the rear tire of the John Deere 8R, his jacket zipped tight against the chill, his boots resting on the cold concrete. For the first time in months, he didn't have a spreadsheet open. He didn't have his tablet in hand. He just sat in the dark, listening to the soft tick of metal cooling down in the quiet shop. His eyes tracked the faint outline of the green hood towering above him. In the stillness, his father's memory hung heavier than ever. He remembered Thomas standing in this exact shop 10 years ago, running his shop rag over a red engine block, lecturing David about loyalty, pride, and doing things the way they had always been done. For decades, Thomas had treated that red paint like an article of faith. But sitting here now, facing a 90-day foreclosure countdown, David saw the tragic flaw in his father's philosophy. Blind brand loyalty hadn't built the farm. It had slowly bled it dry. Thomas had been willing to ignore rising repair bills, sky-high fuel consumption, and dealer neglect just to keep an old image alive. He had mistaken nostalgia for strength, and in doing so, he had left the operation standing on the edge of a financial precipice. David reached out and laid his hand against the smooth, cold surface of the John Deere frame. He realized then that true legacy wasn't about the color of the paint sitting inside the shed. It wasn't about pleasing the gossips at the diner or obeying a bolded paragraph in a dead man's will. True legacy was about keeping 4,000 acres of fertile soil in the family name so his own children would have land to stand on when they grew up. The choice had never been between red and green. It had been between survival and bankruptcy. David stood up from the crate, the cold air filling his lungs, his jaw set firm. The bank had given him 90 days. He wasn't going to spend them brooding in the dark. He was going to work. David didn't let the green fleet sit idle through the bitter Iowa winter. With a $73,000 clock ticking down toward late February, he turned his agricultural operation into an relentless, round-the-clock commercial contract business. Every morning, long before the winter sun cut through the icy horizon, the quiet hum of the John Deere engines echoed across the frozen county roads. David took on every piece of heavy work he could secure. He hooked giant, heavy-duty snow blades to the front of his 8R series tractors, clearing massive commercial parking lots, industrial access roads, and county grain facilities after every blizzard. When the sub-zero Arctic blast swept through the Midwest, dropping temperatures to 20 below zero, the John Deere tractors started effortlessly on cold electrical systems, running 12-hour shifts in punishing conditions without a single hydraulic failure or fluid line freeze. He didn't stop at snow removal. He secured custom deep tillage contracts for larger regional agricultural operations across 2 neighboring counties. Farmers who needed hardpan ground broken before the spring thaw, but lacked the high horsepower iron to work through frozen crust. As the weeks dragged on, something unexpected began to happen across Carroll County. Local farmers, commuting to town in their heated pickups, started stopping along the roadside to watch the green machines work. They saw those John Deere tractors pulling massive loads through drifting snow and hard ground day after day. They noticed the instant cold starts, the sheer working speed, and the clean fuel burn. The quiet respect for hard work, an unspoken rule of the heartland, began to erode the old prejudices. When David walked into the co-op to buy diesel fuel, The cold silence was gone. Farmers who had mocked his auction now stepped up to ask genuine questions about the e-auto power transmission performance, cold weather fuel economy, and dealer service response times. David didn't brag, nor did he boast about his workload. He simply answered with facts, sharing his exact operational metrics. By the second week of February, through pure physical grind and relentless machine hours, David's custom contract earnings crossed the finish line. He walked into First Central Bank in Des Moines, handed Marcus Vance a cashier's check for $73,000, and cleared his defaulted balance in full. The credit director looked at the check, then back at David, nodding with quiet, unexpected respect. David had survived the winter, protected his iron, and bought his farm a brand new spring. Spring of 2025 arrived in Carroll County, with gentle, soaking rains and warm sunshine, turning the dry soil into dark, rich seedbeds. The punishing drought of the previous year felt like a distant memory as ideal growing conditions settled across the Midwest. David took to the fields early, utilizing the advanced precision guidance and variable rate planting systems on his John Deere tractors. The green fleet worked with clinical efficiency, dropping seed at exact depths and spacing across every single one of his 4,000 acres, without a solitary system error or delay. Throughout the summer, consistent rainfall fed the growing crops. By late August, the corn stalks stood tall and heavy, with full, double-filled ears, while the soybean canopy closed tight and lush green. When October brought the dry, crisp days of the autumn harvest, the John Deere S790 combine rolled into the fields to reap the rewards of David's perseverance. The harvest numbers were nothing short of extraordinary. Field after field yielded grain at record levels, pushing corn averages over 225 bushels per acre, and soybeans past 62 bushels. The high operational efficiency of the green fleet, characterized by minimal grain loss, low fuel consumption per acre, and zero unexpected downtime, maximized every dollar brought in from the grain elevator. When the final haul was accounted for, and all operating expenses were settled, the Hollenbeck farm posted a staggering net profit of $340,000. The operational insolvency that had threatened to destroy his family's legacy was officially crushed. The dramatic turnaround did not go unnoticed. The narrative in Carroll County shifted completely. The very farmers who had stood at the co-op months earlier, mocking David's decision and predicting his downfall, now pulled their trucks up to his shop driveway. They came not with skepticism, but with genuine curiosity. They stood beside David on the clean concrete shop floor, inspecting the John Deere machines, asking detailed questions about his fuel logs, GPS accuracy, and overall cost per acre. David answered every inquiry with total transparency, sharing his spreadsheet metrics and real-world performance data. By late winter, the local agricultural landscape had begun a quiet transformation. Inspired by David's indisputable financial results and operational resilience, 3 of his most traditional, red iron-loving neighbors walked into the regional dealership and placed factory orders for brand-new John Deere tractors. By late summer of 2026, the green fleet had accumulated over 4,200 collective operating hours across the Hollenbeck acres. The hard operational data was indisputable, comparing the fuel, maintenance, and precision application logs against the farm's old equipment records revealed a staggering $81,000 in total direct fuel savings alone. The enterprise was not just surviving, it was robust, highly profitable, and financially secure for the first time in over a decade. Yet, the personal toll of David's choice remained etched into his life. His mother had passed away the previous winter without ever breaking her silence, holding firm to her late husband's rigid sense of brand loyalty to her final breath. Extended family gatherings were still quiet and strained, with uncles and cousins remaining distant. But as David looked out over the thriving fields from the shop porch, he carried no bitterness. He understood that leadership meant bearing the weight of difficult decisions when others could only see the past. On a warm August afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden light across the maturing corn, David stood near the open shed doors. Beside him was his 9-year-old son, Noah. The boy's eyes were locked onto the polished green hood of the John Deere 8R, glowing bright in the evening sun. Noah looked up at his father, his face full of quiet awe, and asked if he'd be big enough to drive the main tillage tractor by himself next spring. David smiled, placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, and looked out across 4,000 acres of unbroken, fertile Iowa soil. He realized then that true legacy had never been about preserving a cold piece of painted metal in a shed or pleasing the traditionalists at the local diner. Legacy was keeping the family name on the land, protecting the soil for the next generation, and building an operation strong enough to last. The paint on the machinery was green now, but the land beneath the tires was saved. If you enjoyed this story of agricultural survival, grit, and hard decisions, please like, subscribe, and share this video with fellow farmers. Let us know in the comments below, what does true legacy on the farm mean to you?